Treasury regulations are the Treasury Department's official interpretations of the Internal Revenue Code. The code gives the Treasury Secretary authority to prescribe needful rules to enforce it. Practically, IRS Chief Counsel drafts them and Treasury approves them. On the EA exam, treat regulations as a top-tier authority, stronger than most IRS publications and internal guidance. Courts usually give Treasury regulations a lot of respect, but not unlimited respect. The big idea is, if the regulation is a reasonable interpretation and doesn't contradict the statute, courts tend to uphold it. But courts are not bound by IRS interpretations the way the IRS is. Exam tip: when you see reasonable plus not contrary to the code, that's your green light. Now classify regulations by type. Legislative regulations happen when Congress specifically delegates rulemaking power for a code section. Basically, Treasury, fill in the details. Interpretive regulations are issued under general authority and explain what the code means. Procedural regulations cover administration, how the IRS runs the process, often issued by the Commissioner, not the Treasury Secretary. Legislative regulations carry the most weight because Congress told Treasury to write rules for that area. They can still be overturned, but the challenges are narrower. The regulation goes beyond the delegated power, conflicts with the statute's text, or is unreasonable. On exam questions, legislative regs are the closest thing to same authority as the law, unless they cross one of those lines. Interpretive regulations are more vulnerable. They're not based on a specific delegation for that exact code section. They're Treasury explaining what it thinks Congress meant. So taxpayers can challenge them by arguing they don't reflect congressional intent, or they stretch the statute too far. Procedural regulations are different. They deal with how the IRS administers the law, important, but usually not defining the tax itself. Next classification is status: proposed, temporary, and final. Proposed regulations are basically a draft, published for public comment, and they can be revised or withdrawn. Temporary regulations are immediate guidance and can stay in effect for up to 3 years. Final regulations are the official Treasury decision and carry the highest authority among regulation statuses. Here's the publication path they like to test. Regulations are published in the Federal Register first. That's the government's daily rulebook journal. After that, they're organized by subject and codified into the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR. If you see Federal Register, think publication and effective dates. If you see CFR, think where the regulation lives permanently by topic. Which pronouncement has the highest authoritative weight with the IRS? The choices are a private letter ruling, Treasury regulations, a tax court ruling, or a revenue ruling. Think about which one is the official, generally applicable interpretation tied directly to the Internal Revenue Code. Think about it. The best answer is Treasury regulations. They're the Treasury Department's official interpretation of the code and generally outrank IRS rulings and taxpayer-specific guidance. A tempting wrong answer is a tax court ruling because it sounds powerful, but the question asks authoritative weight with the IRS's guidance. Regulations are the top pick here. Courts give weight to Treasury regulations and generally uphold them as long as the IRS's interpretation is what? The options include reasonable, permitted, according to congressional intent, or allowable. Focus on the standard courts use when reviewing whether a regulation stands. Think about it. The correct answer is reasonable. Courts generally uphold Treasury regulations when the interpretation is reasonable and not contrary to the Internal Revenue Code. A tempting wrong choice is according to congressional intent, because that's a real concept, but the classic test language you'll see is reasonableness plus consistency with the statute.